My name is Avery Morgan. I'm 26 years old, and I live in Nashville, Tennessee, in a small apartment near the Cumberland River. From the outside, my life looks normal. I walk through local parks, grab coffee at cozy cafes, and blend into the city's laid-back vibe. But inside, I've always carried a weight I couldn't explain, a heaviness that's followed me since childhood. It's the kind of feeling that makes you question yourself, doubt your worth, and second-guess every decision. For years, I thought it was just me. But a DNA test changed everything, exposing a secret my parents, Linda and James Morgan, hid from me. A secret that explained why they treated me so cruelly when I was a kid. Now I'm ready to make them face the consequences. Growing up, my childhood was a minefield. Linda, 54, and James, 57, weren't the kind of parents who hit me, but their words and actions cut deeper than any bruise. They called me a burden, said I ruined everything, and punished me for the smallest mistakes. If I spilled a glass of water, I wasn't just clumsy, I was careless and a problem. If I asked for help with homework, I was demanding too much. They'd lock me in my room for hours, ignore me at dinner, or give me the silent treatment until I apologized for things I didn't understand. I grew up believing I didn't deserve love, that I was fundamentally flawed. Those memories still creep into my mind, making me hesitate when I meet new people or try to speak up. I struggle with a gnawing sense of inadequacy, a voice in my head that says I'll never be enough. For years, I thought maybe I was a difficult child. Maybe I deserved their anger, but everything changed when I took a DNA test. In Nashville, lots of folks get into genealogy, tracing their roots to Scottish or Irish ancestors, and I figured it'd be a fun distraction. I sent my sample to a lab, expecting some quirky facts about my heritage. Instead, the results uncovered something I never could have imagined, a connection that led me to the truth about my parents' cruelty. The test didn't point to a long-lost relative. Instead, it matched me with someone named Peter, a man who turned out to be an old family friend from my parents' past. The DNA platform flagged him because of a shared genetic marker, not a blood relation, but close enough to suggest a connection. Curious, I reached out, and he agreed to meet me at a cafe by the river. When we sat due, his eyes carried a weight that told me he knew something big. Over coffee, Peter dropped a bombshell. My parents' marriage was falling apart long before I was born, torn apart by their own fights and resentments. But instead of facing their issues, they turned me into their scapegoat. They blamed me for their problems, told everyone I was a problem child to justify their harsh treatment. Peter had seen it, how they'd snap at me for nothing, make me feel small to cover their own failures. Dee tried to talk to them once, but they shut him out, cutting contact to keep their secret safe. I sat there, stunned. All those years of feeling worthless, of believing I was the problem, it was a lie. Linda and James hadn't just been cruel, they'd deliberately made me their punching bag to hide their broken marriage. They built a facade of being a perfect couple, and I was the collateral damage. The DNA test, by pure chance, had led me to Peter, the one person who could confirm the truth. It was like the universe was giving me a chance to set things right. Anger burned inside me, but it wasn't reckless. It was sharp, focused. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. They'd spent years crafting an image in Nashville, church-going, respectable, the kind of couple everyone admired. I wanted that image to crumble. I wanted their friends, their neighbors, the people who thought they were saints, to see the truth. I wanted Linda, who prided herself on her perfect mother persona, to feel the shame of being exposed. And I wanted James, who always stood by her, to face the fallout. My first step was to find proof. I knew Linda and James still lived in the same house on the outskirts of Nashville, where I grew up. Our relationship was distant, polite but cold. I'd visit occasionally to pick up old stuff or keep up appearances, but we weren't close. One day, when they were out, I went to their house and headed to the attic. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I had a gut feeling they'd left something behind. Among dusty boxes and old clothes, I found a folder tucked away in a corner. It wasn't a diary. Linda wasn't the journaling type, but a collection of letters she'd written to a friend who'd moved away years ago. In them, she admitted how hard it was to deal with me, how I ruined their marriage, how they had to be strict to keep me in line. She wrote that blaming me made it easier to look good in front of others. Then I found James's notes, scribbled plans about how to discipline me to stop me from interfering in their lives. It was a blueprint of their cruelty, laid out in black and white. Holding those papers, I felt a mix of rage and clarity. This wasn't just bad parenting. It was a calculated choice to break me down so they could save face. Now I had the evidence to expose them. My plan wasn't to confront them directly. That'd be too easy for them to dismiss. I wanted their community to turn on them, the people they cared about most. I'd make copies of the letters and notes and get them to the right people, their church group, their neighbors, the ones who always smiled at them. But I needed more than documents. I needed someone to back me up. I thought of Margie, our old neighbor who lived next door when I was a kid. She was kind but kept her distance, never prying into our family. I found her number in an old Nashville phone book. People here still use those and ask to meet. We sat in a quiet cafe on the edge of town, and I told her what Peter had shared. Margie's face fell. She admitted she'd seen how Linda and James treated me, yelling over nothing, making me feel like I was always in the way. She hadn't spoken up, thinking it wasn't her place, but now she wished she had. Her words were the confirmation I needed. I wasn't imagining my pain. With the letters, James's notes, and Margie's testimony, I had everything I needed to start. My plan was simple but deliberate. Get the truth to their circle without making it look like a stunt. I'd slip copies of the letters into mailboxes, leave them in the church hall where Linda volunteered, let the truth spread like wildfire. I didn't need a big scene, just enough to make their friends whisper, their neighbors question, their perfect image crack. Linda would hate, losing the respect she clung to. James would hate the judgment, and I'd make sure they knew it was because of me. I started by copying the letters, careful to keep the originals safe. I picked out a few key people, Linda's church friend, the neighbor who always hosted barbecues and planned how to get the documents to them. It felt like the beginning of justice. I wasn't erasing my scars, but I was taking back control. They'd regret what they did to me, and I was just getting started. Sitting in my apartment in Nashville, the folder of letters and notes from my parents, attic spread out on my coffee table, I felt a strange mix of determination and unease. The papers were proof of what Linda and James had done, how they'd blamed me for their crumbling marriage, punished me for their own failures, and left me with scars that still made me doubt myself. Every time I tried to speak up in a group or meet someone new, that old feeling of being not enough crept in, a direct result of their cruelty. The DNA test had led me to Peter, their old friend who'd confirmed their lies, and Margie, our former neighbor, had backed up his story. Now I had everything I needed to make them pay, not with violence or drama, but with the truth. I wanted their perfect image in Nashville, the one they'd guarded so fiercely, to shatter in front of the people they cared about most. My plan was simple but deliberate. Get those letters and notes to their church friends, neighbors, and acquaintances, the ones who saw Linda as the ideal mother and James as the quiet, dependable husband. I wasn't going to mail them or make a public spectacle. That felt too risky, like they could spin it as me being unhinged. Instead, I'd place the copies where they'd be found naturally, letting the truth spread like ripples in the Cumberland River. But first, I needed to make sure my evidence was airtight, and that I could deliver it without being traced back too easily. I also needed one more piece to strengthen my case, something to make their friends pause and question everything. I started by organizing the documents. The letters from Linda to her friend were the most damning. In her neat handwriting, she'd written things like, "Avery's such a handful. It's no wonder our marriage is struggling. And we have to be tough on her to keep things under control." She depainted me as the problem, admitting they used me to deflect from their own issues. James's notes were colder, more calculated bullet points about discipline and keeping Avery in line, so I wouldn't cause trouble for their reputation. Reading them again made my stomach churn, but it also fueled my resolve. I made clean copies of the most incriminating pages, careful to preserve the originals in a locked box under my bed. I wasn't taking any chances. To make the plan work, I needed to know more about my parents' current social circle. Linda was deeply involved in their church, a small but tight-knit community in East Nashville. She helped organize potlucks, sang in the choir, and always had a smile for everyone. James was less active but still showed up, shaking hands and playing the part of the supportive husband. Their friends, people like Susan, who led the church's charity drives, and Tom, a neighbor who hosted backyard barbecues, thought they were flawless. I'd overheard enough at rare family dinners to know these were the people whose opinions mattered to Linda. If they saw the truth, it would hit her where it hurt. I decided to scope out their church first. I wasn't a regular there. My parents' coldness had pushed me away from their world, but I knew the layout from childhood. The community hall had a bulletin board where people left flyers, prayer requests, and notes. It was the perfect place to accidentally leave a copy of one of Linda's letters. I figured if someone found it, they'd read it, whisper about it, and the news would spread. But I needed to be careful. If Linda or James caught wind of this too early, they might try to spin a story to save face. I drove to the church one evening, parking a block away to avoid notice. The lot was quiet, just a few cars from a choir practice. I slipped inside the community hall, clutching a folded copy of one of Linda's letters. The bulletin board was cluttered with bake sale announcements and prayer lists. I pinned the letter near the bottom, half tucked under a flyer, so it looked like it had been left by mistake. My heart raced as I stepped back, checking to make sure no one saw me. It was a small step, but it felt huge. That one piece of paper could start unraveling their perfect image. Next, I needed to get the truth to their neighbors. Tom, the barbecue guy, lived a few houses down from my parents. He was the kind of person who'd talk to everyone, and I knew he'd share anything juicy. I decided to leave a copy of James's notes in his mailbox, but I had to make it look natural, like it was misplaced. I stuffed the notes into an unmarked envelope, scrawled Tom on it in generic handwriting, and dropped it in his mailbox late at night when the street was dark. I figured he'd open it, read the cold, calculated words about disciplining me, and start asking questions. But I knew documents alone might not be enough. People could dismiss them as old or out of context. I needed someone else to corroborate the story, someone who'd seen my parents' behavior firsthand. Margie had already helped, but I remembered another person, Clara, a former babysitter who looked after me when I was young. She'd always been kind, but I recalled her giving my parents odd looks when they snapped at me. I hadn't seen her in years, but I tracked her down through a mutual acquaintance in Nashville. She still lived in town, in a small house near the river. I called Clara and asked if we could meet. She agreed, and we sat down at a diner on the edge of the city, the kind of place with sticky tables and strong coffee. I told her about the DNA test, Peter's story, and the letters I'd found. Clara's face tightened as I spoke. She said she'd always felt something was off with Linda and James. She remembered how they'd yell at me for things like forgetting to clean my plate, how they'd make me sit alone while they argued in the next room. She'd overheard Linda once say, "If Avery wasn't here, we wouldn't have these problems." Clara hadn't known what to do back then. She was just a teenager herself. But now she wished she'd spoken up. She agreed to back me if anyone asked questions, saying she'd tell the truth about what she saw. With Clara's support, I felt more confident. The letters, James's notes, Margie's testimony, and now Clara's story gave me a solid foundation. I wasn't just relying on old papers. I had people who could confirm my parents' cruelty. But I still had to be strategic. I decided to target one more person, Susan, Linda's church friend. She was influential, the kind of woman whose opinions swayed others. If she believed me, the rest of their circle would follow. I planned to leave a copy of both the letter and the notes in the church's donation box, where Susan often sorted contributions. I'd make it look like they'd been accidentally mixed in with other papers. Before I did that, I wanted to test the waters. I went to a church potluck, not as a participant but as a visitor, lingering near the edges to listen. I overheard Susan talking about Linda, praising her for her dedication to the community. It made my skin crawl, knowing how fake it all was. I didn't stay long, but I left with a clearer picture of how to approach Susan. I'd slip the documents into the donation box the next day, during a time when she'd be there to find them. As I drove back to my apartment, the city lights reflecting off the river, I felt a strange calm. I was taking control, something I'd never had as a kid. The weight of my trauma was still there, but using it to expose Linda and James gave me purpose. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. People might not believe me at first, or my parents might try to twist the story. But I had the truth on my side, and I was ready to let it do the talking. The letters were just the beginning. Soon, their perfect little world would start to crack, and I'd be there to watch it fall. Back in my Nashville apartment, I couldn't stop checking my phone, half expecting a call from Linda or James, demanding to know what I'd done. I'd placed the first copies of their damning letters and notes, Linda's confessions about blaming me for their failing marriage, James's cold plans to discipline me, on the church bulletin board and in Tom's mailbox. I'd also slipped a set into the church donation box, where Susan, Linda's influential friend, would likely find them. My goal was to unravel their perfect image, the one they'd built over years in Nashville's tight-knit community. The emotional scars they'd left me with, the insecurity that made every social interaction feel like a test, drove me to keep going. I wasn't just angry, I was methodical. I wanted their friends, their church, their neighbors to see them for who they really were. A few days after leaving the documents, I noticed the first signs that my plan was working. I'd gone to a cafe near the river, one of those places with wooden tables and the hum of local musicians, when I overheard two women from my parents' church whispering nearby. "Did you see that letter in the hall?" one said, her voice low. "It was from Linda about Avery. I couldn't believe it." The other nodded, her face troubled. "Makes you wonder what else they've been hiding." My heart pounded, but I kept my eyes on my coffee, pretending not to listen. The letter I'd pinned to the bulletin board had been found, and it was already stirring questions. I didn't know who'd seen it first, but it didn't matter. The whispers were spreading, just as I'd hoped. I knew I had to keep the momentum going, but I needed to be careful. If Linda or James realized I was behind this, they might try to twist the narrative, paint me as the bitter daughter lashing out. I decided to check in with Margie, the old neighbor who'd confirmed their cruelty. I drove to her house, a small bungalow on a quiet street lined with oak trees. She welcomed me in, her face kind but wary, like she knew I was up to something. Over tea, I told her about the letters and notes, showing her copies I'd kept. "Margie," I said, "I'm not doing this to hurt them for no reason. They made me feel worthless my whole childhood, and now I know why. I just want people to know the truth." She looked at the papers, her hands trembling slightly, and nodded. "I saw how they treated you, Avery," she said. "I should have done more back then. If you need me to talk to anyone, I will." Her support felt like a lifeline. I asked if she'd be willing to speak to Susan, the church lady, if it came to that. Margie agreed, saying she'd tell the truth about what she'd seen. How Linda and James had snapped at me, blamed me for their fights, made me feel like nothing. With Margie on board, I felt bolder, but I still needed to make sure the documents were reaching the right people. Tom, the neighbor with the barbecues, was next. I dropped James's notes in his mailbox, and I wanted to know if he'd read them. I didn't want to confront him directly. That'd be too obvious, so I took a walk past his house one evening, timing it when I knew he'd be outside tinkering with his grill. Sure enough, he was there, scrubbing the grates. I waved casually like I was just passing by, and he called out, "Hey, Avery, long time." We chatted about nothing, weather, the river, until he paused, his face shifting. "Got something weird in my mail the other day," he said, squinting. "Some notes looked like from your dad about you, strange stuff." I played dumb, raising an eyebrow. "Really? That's odd. What they say?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Just not the kind of thing I'd expect from James, made me think." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, but inside I was buzzing. Tom was curious, maybe even suspicious. That was enough for now. The donation box was my next move. I'd left a letter and a note there for Susan, hoping she'd find them while sorting donations. Susan was the key. Her influence in the church meant that if she believed the truth, others would follow. I didn't want to risk going back to the church myself, so I called Clara, my old babysitter, to see if she'd heard anything. We met at the same diner as before, its neon sign buzzing in the evening light. Clara looked nervous but resolute. "I was at the church yesterday," she said, stirring her coffee. "Susan was talking about some papers she found in the donation box. She didn't say much, but she looked upset, asked me if I knew you well." I leaned forward, keeping my voice calm. "What'd you tell her?" Clara met my eyes. "I said I remembered how your parents treated you, how they'd yell, make you feel small. I didn't mention the letters, but I think she's putting it together." I thanked her, my mind racing. Susan was starting to question things, and Clara's words had added weight to the documents. Now that the seeds were planted, I needed to escalate carefully. I decided to make more copies of the letters and notes, targeting a few more people in their circle. There was Ellen, a woman who ran the church's book club with Linda, and Mike, a guy James played cards with. I'd leave the documents in places they'd find them: Ellen's car, Mike's porch, making it look like someone had dropped them by mistake. I spent an evening at my apartment, carefully copying the most damning pages. Linda's letter about blaming me to save face. James's notes about controlling me to avoid trouble. I used a cheap printer, wearing gloves to avoid fingerprints, a trick I'd picked up from true crime shows. I didn't want to leave any trace that could lead back to me too soon. The next day, I drove to Ellen's house, a tidy place near downtown Nashville. She wasn't home, so I slipped an envelope under her car's windshield wiper, making it look like it had been misplaced. For Mike, I left an envelope on his porch, tucked under a planter. Each one contained a letter and a note, enough to make them question Linda and James without overwhelming them. I knew Nashville's gossip mill would do the rest. People here talk, especially when something shakes their view of someone they thought they knew. As I drove home, the city's lights glinting off the river, I felt a strange mix of adrenaline and dread. The letters were out there now, in the hands of people who mattered to my parents. I could almost picture Linda's face when she heard the whispers, when her friends started looking at her differently. James, always so quiet, would hate the scrutiny. But I wasn't done. I needed to make sure the truth spread wider, reached more of their circle. I thought about the church's annual picnic, a big event where everyone would be together. It was the perfect place to leave a few more copies, maybe in the parking lot or near the food tables, where they'd be found by curious eyes. I also considered reaching out to one more person, Pastor John, who led their church. He was kind but fair, the kind of man who'd listen if the evidence was clear. I didn't want to approach him directly yet. It was too early. But I could leave a set of documents in his office, maybe slipped into a stack of papers he'd sort through. If he saw the truth, his reaction could tip the scales, turning their community against them. The weight of my childhood trauma still lingered, making me second-guess myself as I planned each step. But every time I doubted, I looked at those letters, read James's cold words, and remembered why I was doing this. Linda and James had made me feel worthless to protect their image. Now I was going to make sure that image burned. I wasn't sure how they'd react when the truth came out, but I was ready for it. The whispers had started, and I was just getting warmed up. The air in Nashville felt heavier as I walked along the Cumberland River, the city's lights flickering in the distance. I'd set my plan in motion, planting copies of Linda's letters and James's notes, proof of how they'd blamed me for their failing marriage and abused me to cover it up in strategic places. The church bulletin board, Tom's mailbox, Susan's donation box, Ellen's car, and Mike's porch. Those documents laid bare their cruelty, the way they'd made me feel worthless as a child, leaving scars that still made me doubt myself in every conversation, every new encounter. The DNA test that led me to Peter, their old friend, had given me the truth, and Margie and Clara, my former neighbor and babysitter, had backed it up with their memories. Now, the whispers were spreading, and I could feel the ground shifting under my parents' perfect image. But I wasn't prepared for how fast things would escalate, or for the moment they'd come for me. It started with a phone call from Linda. I was in my apartment, sorting through more copies of the letters when my phone buzzed. Her name on the screen sent a chill through me. I let it ring twice before picking up, keeping my voice steady. "Hello?" Her tone was sharp, the way it used to be when I was a kid and she'd caught me doing something wrong. "Avery, we need to talk. Now, meet us at the house." She didn't wait for a reply, just hung up. I knew this was coming. They must have heard about the letters. My stomach twisted, that old childhood fear creeping in, but I pushed it down. This wasn't about me being small anymore. I had the truth, and I wasn't backing off. I drove to their house on the outskirts of Nashville, the same place where I'd grown up, where their words had cut me down day after day. When I walked in, Linda was pacing the living room, her face tight with anger. James sat on the couch, silent but glaring. The air felt thick, like it used to when they'd corner me as a kid. "What are you playing at, Avery?" Linda snapped, holding up a crumpled copy of one of her letters. I recognized it, the one where She admitted blaming me to save face. "Where did you get this? Why are you spreading lies?" I took a breath, keeping my voice calm. "It's not a lie, Linda. It's your own words. I found your letters, James's notes. You blamed me for your problems, made me feel like nothing to protect your image." Her eyes widened, but she didn't back down. "You're twisting things," she said. "You were a difficult child. We did our best." James nodded, finally speaking. "You're making a fool of yourself, Avery. Stop this." I expected their denial, but it still stung. That old insecurity, the one they'd planted, whispered that maybe I was wrong, maybe I was overreacting, but I held on to the truth. "You lied," I said, meeting their eyes. "You made me your scapegoat so you wouldn't have to face your own mess, and now people know." Linda's face flushed. "Who have you shown this to?" she demanded. I didn't answer, just turned and left. I wasn't going to let them pull me into their game. But as I drove away, I knew they'd try to spin this, tell their friends I was unstable. I had to move faster. The next day, I checked in with Clara, my old babysitter, at the diner near the river. She looked worried but resolute. "Susan called me," she said, stirring her coffee. "She's been asking questions about your parents. That letter in the donation box shook her. She showed it to Ellen, and they're talking about it with the book club." I nodded, my pulse quickening. Susan and Ellen were key players in Linda's church circle. If they were doubting her, others would follow. Clara leaned forward. "Susan asked if I knew anything about how they treated you. I told her the truth, how they'd yell at you, make you feel like you were the problem. She didn't say much, but I could tell she was rattled." Clara's confirmation was exactly what I needed. The documents were working, and her words were adding weight. I decided it was time to push harder. The church's annual picnic was coming up, a big event where Linda and James would be in their element, smiling and shaking hands. It was the perfect place to spread the truth wider. I made more copies of the letters and notes, focusing on the most damning parts. Linda's admission that she blamed me to look good, James's plans to keep me in line. I planned to scatter them in subtle places, under napkins on the food tables, tucked into hymnals in the picnic area, even in the parking lot where people might find them. I wasn't aiming for a big reveal. I wanted the truth to seep out, like a slow leak they couldn't plug. Before the picnic, I checked in with Margie, the neighbor who'd seen their cruelty firsthand. We met at her bungalow, and I showed her the new copies. "I'm taking this to the picnic," I said. "People need to know who they really are." Margie frowned, her hands clasped tight. "Be careful, Avery. They're already talking. Tom mentioned those notes you left in his mailbox. He showed them to Mike, and they're wondering what's going on." I nodded, grateful for the update. Tom and Mike, the barbecue and card game guys, were starting to question things. If I could get the picnic to tip the scales, their whole circle might turn. The day of the picnic, I drove to the park near the church, where tables were set up with checkered cloths and the smell of fried chicken hung in the air. I stayed on the edges, blending in with the crowd, a baseball cap pulled low. Linda was there, laughing with Susan, while James chatted with Pastor John. They looked so normal, so untouchable. It made my blood boil, but I kept my cool. I slipped a few copies of the letters under napkins on a dessert table. tucked others into hymnals left on benches, and dropped one in the grass near the parking lot where someone would spot it. Each move was quick, practiced, my hands steady despite the adrenaline. As I left, I saw Susan pick up a napkin, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the paper underneath. She unfolded it, her face going still as she read. I didn't stick around to see more, but I knew the spark was lit. Back at my apartment, I got a call from Clara. "It's happening," she said, her voice tight. "Susan showed the letter to Pastor John. They're talking about confronting your parents. People are shocked." I thanked her, my heart racing. The picnic had done its job. The truth was spreading faster now, reaching beyond whispers to open questions. But I wasn't done. Linda and James's confrontation at their house showed they were rattled, but they'd try to fight back, maybe claim the letters were fake. I needed one final push to make sure their community turned on them for good. I thought about Pastor John. He was fair, respected, and if he believed the truth, his influence could seal their fate. I decided to leave one last set of documents in his office, slipped into a stack of papers he'd see. I'd include a note, not signed, just a few lines, saying, "Ask Margie and Clara about Linda and James Morgan's daughter." It was a risk, but it would tie everything together. As I prepared the final copies, that old insecurity tugged at me, the voice saying I was going too far, that I'd regret this. But I looked at Linda's letter again, her words about using me to save her image, and I pushed the doubt away. They de-built their lives on lies, and I was tearing those lies down. The picnic had started the fire, and Pastor John would fan the flames. Soon, Linda would see her perfect world collapse, and I'd be there to watch her regret it. The Nashville skyline glowed faintly outside my apartment window as I sat on my couch, staring at the stack of copied letters and notes I'd prepared for Pastor John. My plan to expose Linda and James Morgan, my parents, who'd abused me as a child to cover their failing marriage, was unfolding faster than I'd expected. Their lies had left me with emotional scars, a deep-seated insecurity that made every social interaction feel like a battle. The DNA test that led me to Peter, their old friend, had revealed the truth, and with Margie and Clara's accounts, I'd built a case. I'd scattered proof of their cruelty, Linda's letters admitting they blamed me to save face, James's notes plotting to discipline me across their world. The church bulletin board, Tom's mailbox, Susan's donation box, Ellen's car, Mike's porch, and the church picnic. Now the whispers were turning into a roar, and I was about to push it over the edge. I'd slipped a final set of documents into Pastor John's office, tucked into a stack of papers with a note. "Ask Margie and Clara about Linda and James Morgan's daughter." It was a gamble, but Pastor John was respected, and if he took the evidence seriously, their church community, the heart of their perfect image, would turn. I didn't have to wait long for signs it was working. 2 days after the picnic, Clara called me, her voice hushed but urgent. "Avery, it's chaos at the church." Susan showed Pastor John the letter from the donation box, and he found the ones you left in his office. He's been asking around, talking to people like Ellen and Tom. They're all shocked. She paused. "Susan said she confronted Linda after the picnic. Linda tried to brush it off, said it was a misunderstanding, but Susan was buying it. I gripped the phone, my heart racing. The truth was spreading and Linda was scrambling. I decided to see the fallout for myself. I drove to the church on a Sunday morning, not to attend the service, but to linger outside, near the parking lot where people chatted after. I stayed in my car, watching as the congregation spilled out. Susan and Ellen stood together, their faces tight, whispering as they glanced at Linda, who was nearby, forcing a smile while talking to another woman. I couldn't hear them, but the way Susan's eyes narrowed told me she wasn't fooled anymore. Tom was there too, talking to Mike, the card game guy, and I saw him gesture animatedly, holding what looked like a copy of James's notes. The community was turning, piece by piece, and I could feel the weight of their judgment shifting toward my parents. That evening, I met Margie at her bungalow to get her take. She looked shaken but resolute, pouring tea with steady hands. "Pastor John called me," she said. "He asked about you, about how Linda and James treated you when you were little. I told him everything, how they'd yell at you for nothing, make you feel like you were the problem. I mentioned Clara, too, and he said he'd talk to her." Margie's eyes softened. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner, Avery, but I'm doing it now." I thanked her, feeling a mix of gratitude and determination. Margie's words, combined with Clara's, were cementing the truth. The documents weren't just papers anymore. They were a mirror held up to Linda and James's lies. The next day, I got a call from an unknown number. It was Pastor John. His voice was calm but serious. "Avery, I've come across some troubling documents about your parents. Margie and Clara confirmed some things, and I'd like to talk to you." My pulse spiked, but I kept my tone neutral. "Sure, Pastor. What do you want to know?" He asked about my childhood, gentle but direct. I told him the truth, how Linda and James punished me for their own problems, how their words made me feel worthless, how those scars still made me doubt myself. I didn't mention the letters or my plan. I played it like I was just answering his questions. He listened quietly, then said, "I'm sorry you went through that. I'm addressing this with the congregation. This kind of behavior isn't what we stand for." I thanked him, my hands shaking as I hung up. Pastor John's involvement was a turning point. If he was taking it seriously, their community was about to close ranks. The fallout came faster than I expected. By the next Sunday, I heard from Clara that Pastor John had spoken at the service, not naming me directly, but addressing dishonesty and harm in the community. He'd referenced the documents, saying they'd been found by multiple people and corroborated by witnesses. Clara said the congregation was buzzing afterward, with Susan, Ellen, and others pulling back from Linda, their usual warmth replaced by guarded looks. Tom and Mike had stopped inviting James to their card games, and the barbecue invites had dried up. Linda and James were losing their place in the world they'd built, and I could imagine Linda's panic. She'd always cared more about her image than anything else. But they weren't giving up without a fight. That evening, I got another call from Linda, this time more desperate. "Avery, you have to stop this," she said, her voice trembling. "People are saying awful things about us. Those letters aren't what they seem. You're ruining us." I stayed calm, letting her words wash over me. "You ruined me first," I said. "You made me feel like nothing to protect yourselves. Now everyone knows." She started to argue, but I heard James in the background, his voice low and angry. "Hang up, Linda, she's not worth it." The line went dead, and for the first time I saw a crack in Linda's armor. Her desperation was the first sign of regret, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. I knew I had to keep the pressure on. The church picnic and Pastor John's actions had shaken their circle, but I wanted to make sure the condemnation stuck. I decided to target one last place, the local coffee shop where Linda and her church friends often met. It was a cozy spot near downtown, the kind of place where gossip spread as fast as the smell of fresh coffee. I made a final set of copies, Linda's most damning letter, paired with James's coldest note, and planned to leave them on a table, mixed in with some magazines where someone would find them. I also wrote another anonymous note. "Talk to Margie or Clara about the Morgans." I'd drop it off during a busy morning when the shop was packed with their friends. Before I did, I met Clara one last time at the diner. She looked exhausted but determined. "People are talking, Avery," she said. "Susan and Ellen are done with Linda. They're telling everyone she lied about you to cover her own problems. Pastor John's planning a meeting with the church board to discuss it." I nodded, feeling a strange calm. The truth was out, and it was working. But I still needed that final push to make sure Linda and James couldn't claw their way back. The coffee shop was my last play, and I was ready to make it count. As I prepared the documents, that familiar insecurity crept in, the voice telling me I was going too far, that I'd be the one to regret this. But I looked at the letters, at Linda's own words admitting she'd used me, and I pushed the doubt away. They debuilt their lives on my pain, and now they were facing the consequences. The coffee shop drop would be the final nail, and I could already see Linda's face when she realized her world had crumbled. I was so close to justice, and I wasn't stopping now. Sitting in my Nashville apartment, the faint hum of the city outside, I felt a quiet resolve settle over me. My plan to expose Linda and James Morgan, my parents, who'd abused me as a child to hide their failing marriage, was nearly complete. Their lies had left me with emotional scars, an insecurity that shadowed every step I took, making me feel like I'd never be enough. The DNA test that led me to Peter, their old friend, had uncovered the truth, and with Margie and Clara's accounts, I'd built a case that couldn't be ignored. I'd spread proof of their cruelty, Linda's letters admitting they blamed me to save face, James's notes plotting to discipline me across their world. The church bulletin board, Tom's mailbox, Susan's donation box, Ellen's car, Mike's porch, the church picnic, and Pastor John's office. The whispers had turned into open condemnation, and now, with one final move at the coffee shop, I was ready to seal their fate. The coffee shop drop was my last play. I'd chosen a busy morning, when Linda's church friends and their neighbors filled the cozy spot near downtown Nashville, the air thick with the scent of fresh coffee and pastries. I slipped in, wearing a hoodie to blend in, and left a set of documents, Linda's most damning letter and James's coldest note, on a table near the magazines with a small anonymous note. "Talk to Margie or Clara about the Morgans." I made sure it looked accidental, like someone had left them behind. As I walked out, I saw Susan, the church lady, glance at the table, her eyes narrowing. My pulse raced, but I kept moving, knowing the papers would do their work. The fallout came swiftly. Clara called me that afternoon, her voice a mix of excitement and nerves. Avery, the coffee shop, was a turning point. Susan found the papers and showed them to the whole book club. "They're done with Linda. Ellen said she can't look at her the same way anymore. Even Pastor John brought it up at a church meeting, saying the community needs to hold people accountable." She paused. "People are talking about you, too, not in a bad way, but like they're sorry for what you went through." I thanked her, my heart pounding. The documents had spread like wildfire, and the community that once adored Linda and James was turning their backs. I saw the evidence myself a few days later, walking past the church. I didn't go inside, but I lingered near the parking lot, watching people leave after a service. Linda and James were there, but the usual crowd around them was gone. Susan and Ellen walked past without a word, their faces cold. Tom, the barbecue guy, didn't even glance at James, who stood awkwardly by their car. Mike, the card game friend, was talking to another man, gesturing sharply as if explaining something, likely the notes I'd left on his porch. The community's warmth, the thing Linda craved most, had vanished. I could see it in her posture, the way her shoulders slumped, the way she avoided eye contact. It was the first real sign of her regret, and it hit me harder than I expected. That evening, Linda showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door, and there she was, her face pale, her eyes red. James wasn't with her, which surprised me. He was always her silent shadow. "Avery," she said, her voice breaking, "please stop this. I know we weren't perfect, but you're destroying us. People won't talk to us anymore. The church, our friends, they're all turning away." I stood in the doorway, my arms crossed, keeping my expression steady. "You destroyed me first," I said. "You made me feel worthless to protect your image. Now you're feeling what I felt." She started to cry, reaching out, but I stepped back. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. We were struggling, and it was easier to blame you." Her words were a confession, but they came too late. I shook my head. "You chose to hurt me. Now you live with the consequences." I closed the door, my hands shaking but my resolve firm. The next day, I met Margie at her bungalow to check in. She looked relieved, like a weight had lifted. "Pastor John spoke to the congregation again," she said. "He didn't name names, but he talked about honesty and making amends. Everyone knows it's about Linda and James. Susan told me they're not welcome at the book club anymore, and Tom's stopped inviting them to anything." Margie reached for my hand. "You did it, Avery. They're facing what they did." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of triumph and emptiness. The community had rejected them, just as I'd planned. Linda's regret was clear, and James, though silent, was losing his place too. I decided to make one final check at the coffee shop, curious to see how far the truth had spread. I walked in during a quiet afternoon, grabbing a seat in the corner. The barista, a woman who knew Linda's crowd, was talking to a customer. "Heard about the Morgans," she said, her voice low. "Those letters going around, turns out they weren't so great to their daughter. Explains why she's kept her distance." The customer nodded, looking shocked. I sipped my coffee, keeping my face neutral, but inside I felt a spark of justice. The truth had taken root, and it wasn't going away. Reflecting on it all, I knew my scars wouldn't vanish. The insecurity Linda and James had burned into me as a child still lingered, making me hesitate in conversations, doubt my worth. But exposing them had given me something I hadn't had before: control. I'd taken their lies and turned them into a weapon, showing their world who they really were. The church, the neighbors, the coffee shop regulars, they all saw Linda and James for the people who'd used me to hide their own failures. Linda's tears at my door were proof she regretted it, but I didn't need her apology. I needed this: their fall, their shame, the justice I'd fought for. I walked along the Cumberland River that night, the water reflecting Nashville's lights. For the first time in years, I felt lighter, like I could breathe without that old weight pressing down. The pain was still there, and maybe it always would be, but I'd reclaimed my story. Linda and James had lost the respect they'd valued more than me, and I'd made sure they knew why. I wasn't the scared kid in their house anymore. I was Avery Morgan, and I'd made them pay.